Hi, hello everyone. Welcome back to my channel. Today let's analyze Matthew Arnold's work, The Study of Poetry. The Study of Poetry, 1880. Matthew Arnold, 1822-1888. The Study of Poetry was first published as the introduction to T.H. Ward's anthology titled The English Poets in 1880. The Study of Poetry is a foundational essay in English criticism articulating why poetry matters and how it should be judged. Arnold raises poetry to a moral and philosophical plane, calling it an indispensable tool for understanding and elevating human life. His essay stands as a call for refined taste, serious engagement, and a cultural responsibility in the study of literature. The work is not a systematic treatise, but a critical preface that evolved into a foundational essay in literary criticism. Arnold advocates for poetry as a substitute for religion and philosophy in a modern life. Now let's analyze the main themes of the study of poetry. The first one, poetry as a higher truth. Arnold argues that poetry can replace religion and philosophy as a guide to life and a morality. It should be pursued not just for pleasure, but as a source of spiritual and intellectual elevation. The touchstone method. Arnold introduces a method of evaluating poetry by comparing it to great lines of past masters. These touchstones are excerpts from poets like Homer, Dante, Shakespeare, and Milton. Historical criticism versus aesthetic judgment. Arnold warns against reducing poetry to historical interest or biographical context. He emphasizes that aesthetic and moral excellence must be the standard for judgment. The moral and emotional power of poetry. Good poetry must have a high seriousness, emotional depth combined with a noble subject matter and style. Poetry as a cultural force. Arnold insists that poetry must shape civilization and be studied for its truth and beauty, not for mere entertainment. Now let's have a look at the central arguments in the study of poetry. Poetry is a criticism of life. Not in the narrow sense of a social criticism, but in expressing deep universal truths with emotional power. Truth and a seriousness over fancy and a pleasure. True poetry must aim for truth, not just beauty or imaginative pleasure. It must be rooted in high seriousness, sincerity, and a truth of substance and style. Great poetry is rare. Great poetry is a higher thing than history, and the majority of verse is of secondary quality. Arnold stresses selectivity, that is, we must only cherish what is truly excellent. Disinterestedness and criticism. A critic must approach poetry without personal bias or contemporary prejudice. He must compare all works against the universal standards of greatness. Now let's analyze the divisions or section-wise summary of the essay. First of all, introduction, the importance of poetry. Arnold claims poetry is capable of replacing religion and philosophy in a guiding human life. He emphasizes poetry's ability to interpret life, console, and sustain the human spirit. The touchstone method. Arnold proposes that true poetic excellence can be gauged by comparing poems with a touchstones. That means lines from the greatest poets. He cites lines from Homer, Dante, Milton, and Shakespeare as examples. He warns that the method should not be applied mechanically, but with a judgment and a sensitivity. Arnold's observations on Geoffrey Chaucer. Matthew Arnold discusses Geoffrey Chaucer and appreciates his naturalness and storytelling. However, Arnold finds him lacking high seriousness and so not among the greatest poets. He argues that Chaucer is delightful but not morally or intellectually elevating. Arnold's observations on John Dryden and Alexander Pope. Arnold admires the style, clarity, and influence, but it denies them the status of great poets. Arnold criticizes them for being more intellectual and rhetorical than emotional or spiritual. He notes their poetry is valuable for culture, but it lacks emotional profundity and imaginative power. Arnold's observations on Thomas Gray, Robert Burns, and other writers. Thomas Gray is praised for some great lines from the poem Elegy written in a country churchyard, but his output is limited. Robert Burns has a strong emotion and a simplicity, but it doesn't always reach the universal or sublime. Arnold emphasizes the inconsistency in minor poets and the need for a standard of comparison. Conclusion, that is, toward the future. Arnold urges readers and critics to adopt standards of greatness, not to be swayed by popularity or historical curiosity. He reinforces the idea that poetry should serve as a spiritual guide, possessing truth and high seriousness. Now let's analyze the key concepts and terms coined or emphasized in the essay. Touchstone method. That means using brief passages from the greatest poets to measure the worth of other poets. High seriousness, a hallmark of great poetry, that is, combination of moral gravity, intellectual depth, and emotional truth. Disinterestedness, the ideal state of the critic, that is, a critic should be free from bias or national pride. Now let's analyze the significance and legacy of Arnold's work. The study of poetry is one of the earliest examples of modern literary criticism. It introduced objective criteria into literary evaluation. This work influenced the later critics like T.S. Eliot, F.R. Lewis, and Cleon Brooks. The work still is relevant in debates over aesthetics versus historical or ideological criticism. Now let's have a look at the criticism of Arnold's essay. Critics argue that Arnold's touchstone method is too subjective and not practical across cultures or eras. Arnold's dismissal of Geoffrey Chaucer, Alexander Pope, and John Dryden as lacking high seriousness has been contested. Yet his vision of poetry as a civilizing force remains influential. Now let's analyze the important quotes from the essay. First one. More and more, mankind will discover that we have to turn to poetry to interpret a life for us, to console us, to sustain us. This quote captures Arnold's central argument, that is, poetry can replace religion and philosophy in offering meaning. He believed that in the modern world, poetry provides moral and spiritual guidance. It is not just artistic expression, but a vital force in shaping how we understand life. Arnold elevates poetry to the status of a civilizing and a spiritual necessity. Now the next quote. The future of poetry is immense because in poetry, our race, as time goes on, will find an ever surer and surer state. Arnold here expresses hope in poetry's enduring value. Unlike science or religion, poetry evolves with the human spirit and adapts to the needs of civilization. He foresees a time when poetry will be the firm foundation of emotional and intellectual life. This vision reflects his deep faith in poetry as a permanent human need. Now the next quote. Poetry is at the bottom a criticism of life. Here Matthew Arnold defines poetry not as escapism but as a reflection on the moral, emotional and philosophical aspects of life. Poetry criticizes life by interpreting it through the lens of emotional truth and ethical seriousness. It shapes and improves human understanding by filtering experience through wisdom. This view laid the groundwork for moralistic literary criticism. Now the next quote. The best poetry will be found to have a power of forming, sustaining and delighting us, as nothing else can. Matthew Arnold emphasizes the transformative power of great poetry. It not only educates and uplifts, but also gives deep pleasure. This triple function, that is forming or shaping character, sustaining, that is giving emotional strength, and delighting, is what makes poetry unique. For Matthew Arnold, only such poetry deserves serious study and admiration. Now the next quote. For the creation of a masterwork of literature, two powers must conquer, the power of man and the power of the moment. Great poetry, Arnold says, arises when a poet's personal genius meets the demands or spirit of the historical moment. This idea suggests that timing and context are as essential as individual talent. A poet must be both inspired and responsive to their cultural environment. Without this unity, the result may lack enduring value. Now the next quote. The greatness of a poet lies in his powerful and beautiful application of ideas to life. Matthew Arnold believed that ideas gain richness and clarity when expressed through poetry. A great poet does not merely entertain, but infuses life with intellectual and emotional insight. The blending of thought and emotion through art is what distinguishes major poetry from minor. This makes poetry both intellectually deep and emotionally resonant. Now the next quote. High seriousness is the most important characteristic of the best poetry. High seriousness means that a great poetry deals with noble themes in a sincere, elevated tone. It reflects the poet's deep moral commitment and emotional truthfulness. This criterion helps Arnold separate entering poetry from superficial or decorative verse. It reflects his belief in poetry's ethical responsibility. Now the next quote. The strongest part of our religion today is its unconscious poetry. Matthew Arnold suggests that what moves people in a religion is often poetic feeling, not dogma. He believes that emotion, imagination, and a symbolic language are what give religion its real power, and these are essentially poetic. In a secular age, poetry can take over religion's role of inspiring and confirming the human soul. This quote shows his vision of poetry as spiritual heritage. The next quote. Criticism must be disinterested. By disinterested, Arnold means that literary criticism must be free from personal bias, national pride, or historical sentimentality. A critic should judge poetry by objective standards of excellence. This is a cornerstone of Arnold's theory, aiming for honesty and integrity in literary judgment. It was a bold challenge to Victorian tendencies of patriotism and a moral partnership. Now the next quote. In poetry, the distinction between excellence and inferior is of paramount importance. Matthew Arnold insists that not all poems are of equal worth and that a careful evaluation is crucial. He urges readers and critics to be selective, favoring only what truly elevates the human spirit. This commitment to qualitative judgment runs throughout his essay. He warns against being swayed by historical interest or popularity alone. Now the next quote. We should conceive of poetry worthily and more highly than it has been accustomed to conceive it. Matthew Arnold criticizes the reduction of poetry to amusement or sentimentality. He calls for a more serious and respectful approach, seeing poetry as an intellectual and a moral pursuit. His goal is to elevate the status of poetry in education and culture. This quote reflects his desire to redefine the cultural purpose of literature. Now the next quote. The best poetry is what we want. The best poetry will be found to have power. Arnold emphasizes quality over quantity in a poetic appreciation. He insists that only the finest poetry, that is both powerful and true, should be studied and passed down. This poetry holds up across generations because of its depth and emotional resonance. The rest, he implies, will fade into irrelevance. The next quote. We owe to Homer the signal virtue of truth of matter and a truth of style. Matthew Arnold praises Homer as a universal touchstone for poetic greatness. Homer's epics demonstrates emotional depth, clarity of language, and a moral nobility. These qualities, Arnold believes, are essential in all great poetry. This line supports his method of using past masters to judge later poets. Now the next quote. It is not what men do which moves us, but what they are. In this subtle reflection, Matthew Arnold points to the emotional and psychological depth that great poetry should capture. Poetry moves readers not by recounting external actions, but by expressing inner character and a moral essence. The soul of poetry lies in human nature and emotion, not mere events. This aligns with his emphasis on high seriousness and a moral depth. Now the next quote. The heroic couplet, however perfect in its own kind, is not the kind of poetry of the future. Matthew Arnold here critiques John Dryden and Alexander Pope's poetic style, dominated by rational, polished couplets. Though elegant, such verses lack the emotional range and moral gravity needed for modern spiritual life. He predicts a move toward poetry that is richer, more profound, and emotionally resonant. This quote reflects his belief in poetry's evolving mission,